It started with a knock, soft, almost polite. But in this town, no one opens the door at midnight. Those who did were never seen again. The small, secluded town of Ravens Hollow sat in the shadow of looming mountains, its narrow streets often shrouded in an eerie mist that seemed alive. Visitors rarely came, and those who stumbled upon the town by accident left quickly, unnerved by the cold, unwelcoming stares of the residents. But for the new arrival, the isolation wasn't a deterrent, it was an escape. Alex, a curious journalist seeking inspiration for their next big story, had rented an old, creaky house on the edge of the woods. The townsfolk whispered about that house, saying it was cursed, though no one dared explain why. Alex, ever the skeptic, dismissed the warnings as mere superstition. On Alex's first evening, while exploring the town, they wandered into a dimly lit diner. The air inside was heavy, conversations hushed. An elderly woman, her face lined with age and fear, beckoned Alex over. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Did anyone tell you about the midnight knocker?" Alex shook their head, intrigued. "It comes at midnight, 3 soft knocks, never more, never less. If you hear it, don't answer. Those who do, vanish." Her bony fingers trembled as she recounted her own loss. Decades ago, her son had disappeared after opening the door to the knocker. He said it sounded human, like someone in need. But when I checked, there was no one there, only footprints leading away from the house. That night, as Alex returned home, the town seemed to grow colder. Doors and windows were tightly shut, as if the entire town was bracing for something. Alex noticed strange markings on the doors, etched symbols, worn with time but still visible. Lying in bed, Alex replayed the old woman's words in their mind, unsure whether to feel scared or amused. Yet as the clock ticked closer to midnight, an unsettling tension filled the room. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and for a moment, Alex thought they heard faint footsteps on the porch. The clock struck 12. Silence. Then, it came. Knock, knock, knock. Soft, deliberate, almost polite. Alex froze, their heart pounding in their chest. They told themselves it was just the wind or a stray branch, but deep down, they knew it wasn't. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as though whoever or whatever was outside knew Alex was listening. Swallowing their fear, Alex tiptoed to the window, careful not to make a sound. Pulling the curtain aside just a sliver, they peered out into the darkness. Nothing. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Alex stood there, breathless, unable to shake the feeling that something had seen them. As they turned away from the window, they noticed muddy footprints on the porch leading to the door but not away from it. The morning after the first knocks, Alex awoke to a heavy silence. The air in the house felt oppressive, as if something unseen lingered just out of sight. Shaking off the lingering fear, Alex chalked it up to overactive imagination. Yet, the muddy footprints on the porch wouldn't leave their mind. Determined to get answers, Alex ventured back into the town. The streets were unusually empty, with curtains drawn tightly over windows. At the diner, Alex tried to strike up conversations, but most people averted their eyes or muttered excuses to leave. Finally, an older man named Samuel, who had been nursing a coffee in the corner, spoke up. "You heard it, didn't you? The knocks." Alex nodded, intrigued by the man's candor. Samuel leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human. It picks its targets. Once it starts knocking, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" Alex asked, but Samuel only shook his head. "I don't think anyone who knows that is still alive to tell the tale." Later that afternoon, while exploring the town, Alex stumbled upon a curious sight, an abandoned library. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the shelves were lined with books that hadn't been touched in decades. In the back corner, Alex found an old file labeled Ravens Hollow Mysteries. The file contained clippings of old newspaper articles, detailing strange disappearances in the town dating back nearly a century. The common thread? Each victim had reported hearing knocks on their door shortly before vanishing. That night, as Alex sifted through the files in the eerie glow of a single lamp, the house groaned and creaked more than usual. And then, just as the clock struck 12, knock, knock, knock. This time, the knocks were louder and more deliberate, reverberating through the house. Alex's heart raced as they clutched the edge of the table. For a fleeting moment, they considered opening the door, just to prove to themselves that nothing was there. But then they remembered Samuel's warning, "It doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." The knocks came again. More insistent now. Alex stood frozen, every instinct screaming to stay away from the door. But curiosity was a powerful thing. Grabbing a flashlight, they approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" Alex called out, their voice trembling. The only response was silence, followed by a final, thunderous knock. Summoning courage, Alex yanked the door open and was met with nothing. The porch was empty, the yard still, but the muddy footprints had returned, leading up to the door. Before Alex could step outside, the flashlight flickered and died. From the corner of their eye, they saw movement, a fleeting shadow darting across the yard. Slamming the door shut, Alex locked it and backed away, heart pounding. By morning, Alex was convinced that whatever was happening was far from over. The morning light did little to soothe Alex's nerves. Sleep had been elusive, replaced by the vivid memory of the knocks and the lingering chill in the air. As Alex moved toward the door to collect their thoughts, something caught their eye, a strange marking etched onto the wood of the front door. The symbol wasn't random. It was intricate, circular, with jagged edges forming an unrecognizable yet ominous pattern. It pulsed faintly under the sunlight, almost as if it were alive. Alex reached out to touch it but immediately pulled their hand back when the surface felt unnaturally cold. Even under the warm sun, unease set in. This wasn't a prank, it was deliberate. Alex snapped a picture of the symbol, determined to find its meaning. Returning to town, Alex showed the photo to several people, only to be met with dismissive glances and murmurs. It was as if everyone recognized the symbol but didn't want to acknowledge it. Frustrated, Alex headed to the diner, where Samuel sat in his usual corner, sipping black coffee. Samuel's expression shifted the moment Alex placed the photo in front of him. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "That's the mark of the knocker," Samuel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean?" Alex demanded, their frustration mounting. "It means it's chosen you," Samuel replied, his voice tinged with regret. "You can't ignore it now. That symbol, it's a tether. It knows where you are. It won't stop." "Stop what?" Alex asked, but Samuel only shook his head, unwilling or unable to elaborate further. Unwilling to leave without answers, Alex returned to the library. This time, they searched with more urgency, combing through dusty books and forgotten files. Hours later, in a locked cabinet, Alex discovered a faded journal bound with fraying leather. The name Eleanor Raven was scrawled on the cover. The entries were dated back to the 1800s, chronicling the life of a woman who once lived in the same house Alex now occupied. Eleanor wrote about the symbol, the knocks, and the dread that consumed her life. She described the sound of footsteps outside her door at night and how she began to see shadowy figures lurking just beyond the tree line. Her last entry sent a chill down Alex's spine. "The mark has appeared. They're closer now. I can hear them even in the silence. Tonight, I'll confront it. If these are my last words, let this journal be my warning. Never open the door." As the sun began to set, Alex felt the weight of Eleanor's words. This wasn't a coincidence. Whatever haunted Eleanor was now after Alex. Back at the house, Alex inspected the marking again. It seemed sharper now, as if it had etched itself deeper into the wood. The air grew colder as the hours ticked by, and the oppressive silence of the night settled in once more. Then, as the clock struck 12, knock, knock, knock. The knocking had returned, louder and more deliberate than before. Alex froze, heart pounding as the sound reverberated through the house. This time, the knocks weren't confined to the door, they echoed from the windows and the walls, as if the house itself was alive with malevolence. Gripping a flashlight, Alex made their way to the door, but instead of opening it, they peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty, shrouded in the dim glow of the porch light. Still, the knocking persisted. Determined to take control, Alex flung the door open, only to be greeted by the stillness of the night. There was no one there. The woods beyond the house loomed, their darkness impenetrable. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it a faint, otherworldly whisper. But something caught Alex's eye. Leading from the porch and into the woods were muddy footprints, bare, human-like, yet impossibly large. The prints glistened as if freshly made, though the ground was dry. Against every instinct screaming to retreat, Alex decided to follow them. With each step deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped the surroundings. Even the usual night sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. The footprints led to a clearing. At its center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its roots twisted into grotesque shapes that clawed at the earth. The bark was marked with the same ominous symbol from Alex's door, but here it seemed alive, pulsating faintly with an eerie blue glow. Alex approached cautiously, every instinct on high alert. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with an unexplainable dread. Suddenly, a movement in the corner of their vision made them spin around. It was a shadow, detached from any source of light. It wasn't human, it was a distorted silhouette with elongated limbs and a jagged, unnatural form. It moved unnaturally fast, gliding from tree to tree, always just out of reach. Alex's breathing quickened as the flashlight flickered, its beam struggling against the encroaching darkness. The shadow stopped, hovering at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, it seemed to study Alex, its hollow, void-like eyes boring into their soul. Then, without warning, it surged forward. Alex stumbled backward, tripping over a root and dropping the flashlight. The world plunged into darkness, and the shadow loomed over them, its presence suffocating. Alex groped for the flashlight, fingers trembling, and finally managed to switch it back on. The beam illuminated the shadow, and for the briefest moment, it recoiled, emitting a guttural, inhuman sound before disappearing into the woods. Shaking and breathless, Alex scrambled to their feet, running back toward the house without looking back. When they finally slammed the door shut, the house felt no safer. And then, from somewhere deep within the woods, came the unmistakable sound of knocking. The knocking echoed faintly from the woods, rhythmic and unyielding. Alex sat on the floor, back pressed against the door, heart racing with a mix of fear and confusion. What had just happened? And why was the knocking now coming from the forest instead of the house? Determined to find answers, Alex retrieved Eleanor Raven's journal from the table where it had been hastily discarded. Flipping through the brittle, yellowed pages, Alex searched for any mention of the clearing or the shadow that had appeared. One entry stood out. I ventured into the woods tonight, drawn by the sound. The tree, the ancient tree, it is the source. The mark burns brighter there. I saw them, the shadowed ones, moving between the trees. They whispered my name. They know me. They know us all. Chills ran down Alex's spine as they realized Eleanor had experienced the same horrors. The journal went on to describe how Eleanor had tried to communicate with the shadows, leaving offerings at the tree and begging for peace. But her pleas had only made them stronger, more persistent. Suddenly, a loud thud broke Alex's focus. It came from upstairs. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Alex cautiously ascended the creaking staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The second floor was bathed in an unnatural gloom, the faint glow from the streetlights barely penetrating the windows. As Alex reached the hallway, they noticed something strange. The door to the attic was ajar. It hadn't been open earlier. A cold draft flowed down from the dark space above, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. Fighting the urge to retreat, Alex climbed the narrow attic stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in from all sides. The attic was cluttered with forgotten furniture and dusty boxes, but what drew Alex's attention was a small, ornate mirror propped against the far wall. The mirror's surface was cracked, and its silver frame was adorned with intricate carvings of symbols eerily similar to the one on the door. As Alex approached, the surface of the mirror shimmered, and an image began to form. It wasn't a reflection, it was a scene. The clearing in the woods appeared, bathed in a ghostly blue light. The tree stood at the center, its markings glowing brighter than ever. Shadows moved around the tree, their forms flickering like dying flames. Then, Alex saw it, a figure standing among the shadows. It wasn't one of them, it was human. They wore a long cloak, their face obscured, but their presence radiated power. The figure raised an arm and pointed directly at Alex. The mirror cracked further, and a deafening whisper filled the attic. It's time. The whisper was followed by a sudden, violent gust of wind that extinguished the flashlight and sent Alex tumbling backward. When they scrambled to their feet, the mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the attic floor. But in the darkness, Alex could still feel eyes watching them, unseen but undeniable. And then, faintly, the knocking resumed. The attic was still, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't dissipated. Alex's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as they stood in the darkness, every inch of their skin crawling. The sound of the knocking had stopped, but the echo of the eerie whisper remained in their mind, repeating those two ominous words, "It's time." A sudden coldness gripped Alex's chest. as if the air itself was alive, feeding on their fear. The shards of the shattered mirror lay scattered on the floor, glittering like broken promises. With trembling hands, Alex fumbled to turn on the flashlight again, the beam flickering before finally illuminating the cluttered attic once more. The space felt smaller now, more suffocating. The boxes and forgotten furniture seemed to close in on Alex, and the shadows that had once been mere shapes now appeared to have depth, as though they were moving. Alex's mind raced, trying to piece together what had been happening, what Eleanor's journal had warned them about. The symbol, the knocks, the shadows. And now, the figure in the mirror. Mustering what little courage remained, Alex descended the attic stairs. The creaking would echoing like footsteps in the silence. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a trap. The walls seemed to breathe, and the very air tasted heavy, like dust and regret. They made their way downstairs to the living room, where the door to the outside stood wide open. A cold draft entered the house, making the room feel colder than it should have been. Outside, the darkness stretched across the yard, and the looming woods seemed to beckon with an unnatural pull. The knocking had stopped, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, waiting. Just then, Alex heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the door. This time, it was coming from the direction of the woods, just beyond the tree line. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like a countdown. Alex's heart raced as they stared out the window, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain the unnatural knocking. But the night outside was still, the woods as quiet as death. Alex's gaze shifted to the trees, and for a split second, they thought they saw something move, a figure, cloaked and tall, standing at the edge of the woods. It was too far to make out clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at the house. The knocking came again, this time louder, as though in response to the figure's gesture. Fear surged through Alex, but it wasn't just the figure that unsettled them. It was the realization that the figure knew them, that it had been watching them. Alex's instincts screamed to run, but the force pulling them toward the door was too strong. They stepped toward the open door, compelled by a force they couldn't explain. Outside, the air was thick with a sense of dread. The figure in the woods remained motionless, as if waiting for Alex to approach. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate, almost as though the earth itself was alive, pulsing in sync with the knocks. With each step Alex took toward the figure, the knocking grew louder, the rhythm faster, and then, just as they reached the edge of the yard, the knocking stopped altogether. The figure in the woods lowered its arm, and for the first time, Alex could make out its face, or rather, its lack of one. The figure's face was a hollow void, an absence of features, a darkness that absorbed light. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were empty pits, black and endless. The ground beneath Alex's feet trembled, and the wind howled through the trees. And then, the figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper, "Come closer." Alex's heart stopped. They couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure's presence was overpowering, suffocating, as if its very existence was drawing them in. The knocking started again, louder this time, a pounding that rattled Alex's bones. And then, from the woods, came the voices, low, guttural, inhuman. They seemed to whisper Alex's name, calling them toward the darkness. The figure stood motionless in the darkness of the woods, its hollow face staring into Alex's very soul. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the woods themselves were alive, urging Alex to take one more step forward. The voice, still low and rasping, echoed through the trees, sending tremors down Alex's spine. "Come closer." Alex's legs felt frozen, as if the earth itself was holding them in place. Every fiber of their being screamed for them to run, to flee from whatever nightmare had been unleashed. Yet they couldn't move. The figure's gaze seemed to hold them captive, its black, void-like eyes drawing them into an abyss of darkness. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches overhead. The once peaceful woods had turned into a twisted maze of shadows, the trees themselves reaching toward Alex, their branches like claws, eager to pull them into the night. The knocking continued, louder now, coming from all directions, surrounding them. The rhythm had changed. It wasn't just a warning now, it was a countdown, each knot growing closer and more frantic. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it was fighting against some unseen force, but it moved closer to Alex with purpose, each step bringing it closer to the edge of the yard. The coldness in the air deepened, and the ground beneath Alex's feet seemed to vibrate more intensely, as if the earth was alive, pulling them toward the figure. The air grew thick, suffocating. As the figure came within reach, it stopped just at the edge of the yard, still staring at Alex with those hollow, dark eyes. And then, for the first time, it spoke again, its voice a raspy, whispering wind that seemed to seep into Alex's very bones. "You should not have come." The words sent a chill down Alex's spine. They had known, in some part of their mind, that the house in the woods were not ordinary, but hearing the figure confirm it made the terror more real, more immediate. Something ancient, something malevolent, lived here, something that had been waiting for Alex. Without warning, the figure extended a long, thin hand, its fingers claw-like, stretching toward Alex. A sense of dread filled the air as the figure's touch seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality itself, warping the space around them. The shadows around Alex seemed to grow darker, thicker, and the ground beneath them cracked and shifted. Alex stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the figure's presence pressing down on them. They turned to run, but the sound of the knocking grew deafening, each strike seeming to come from within their own chest. They couldn't escape. It was as if the very sound was now a part of them, a constant reminder that something was coming. Frantically, Alex glanced back toward the house. The door, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now looked like a prison. The figure's cold, empty gaze followed them, and Alex could feel its power, its influence, tugging at their mind, threatening to overwhelm them. The whispers in the woods seemed to grow louder, now mixed with laughter, low, mocking, and full of malice. Then, the earth shook again, this time with greater force. The ground cracked open beneath Alex's feet, and from the cracks, dark tendrils of shadow began to emerge, coiling up around their legs, pulling them down into the earth. The laughter grew, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of doom. The figure didn't move, but its presence loomed larger, as if feeding off the chaos it had caused. Alex fought against the shadows, struggling to free themselves from the tendrils wrapping around their legs. The whispers became unbearable, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, telling Alex to surrender, to give in, but they couldn't, they wouldn't. In one desperate motion, Alex ripped themselves free from the tendrils, stumbling backward toward the house, but the figure didn't follow. It remained at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting, its eyes still fixed on Alex as they scrambled toward the door. With one final, desperate push, Alex reached the door and slammed it shut, locking it behind them. The knocking ceased instantly, but the silence was deafening. The house felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. The door slammed shut behind Alex with an unsettling finality, but the feeling of dread still clung to them like a second skin. They stood there, panting, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. The figure in the woods, the knocking, the laughter, it all felt like a terrible dream, but the reality of it gnawed at Alex, burrowing itself deep into their mind. Alex glanced around, searching for something, anything, to offer some sense of normalcy. The walls of the house, once comforting, now seemed alien, as if they were trapped inside a place that was no longer their own. The floor creaked underfoot, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching impossibly long. Everything felt off. Turning quickly, Alex spotted the old mirror hanging above the mantelpiece. The reflection in the glass was distorted, a warping effect like ripples across water. For a moment, Alex wondered if their mind had finally snapped, if they were imagining the strange reflections. But then the distorted shapes began to shift, to move, as though alive. The whispers returned, faint at first, but then growing louder and more insistent. Alex stepped toward the mirror, their breath shallow and quick. Their own reflection stared back at them, but something was wrong. Their reflection did not mimic their movements immediately. For a brief, terrifying second, it seemed as though the reflection was moving on its own, detached from Alex's body. The figure in the reflection raised its hand and beckoned them. It was not Alex's hand, it was cold, pale, and skeletal, its fingers elongated like claws. The reflection's eyes were black pits, just like the figure in the woods. Alex's heart pounded in their chest as they stepped closer to the mirror, unable to look away, unable to understand what was happening. The figure in the glass seemed to smile, though no lips parted. The smile was a hollow, empty gesture, like a predator preparing to strike. Alex's breath caught in their throat. The knocking returned, now louder and more frantic, rattling the house as though the walls themselves were protesting. The floor beneath Alex's feet shook with the rhythm of the knocks, and the mirror seemed to tremble along with it. Suddenly, the reflection's face twisted into something grotesque. The skin stretched and distorted, pulling away from the bone, revealing the raw, exposed tissue beneath. The eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to grow larger, darker, as if they were consuming the light around them. Alex stumbled backward, but the reflection did not stop. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its movements jerky but predatory. The figure's hand reached through the glass, not as a reflection, but as though the glass itself had become a portal. The coldness emanating from it was unbearable, like the chill of death itself. Fear surged through Alex. They turned away from the mirror, but the knocking intensified, now coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the house. It felt like the house itself was alive, aware of their every move. In a desperate panic, Alex backed toward the door, trying to escape the overwhelming sense of being trapped. But the house had changed. The door they had slammed shut moments ago no longer appeared the same. It was twisted, the wood warped and splintered as though it were slowly decaying in front of their eyes. The walls, too, seemed to close in, pressing Alex closer to the mirror. The knocking was deafening now, filling the house with its relentless, maddening sound. Then, as if mocking Alex's attempts to flee, the figure in the mirror smiled once again, but this time, its smile was not empty, it was knowing, it was triumphant. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered. The voice was the same low rasp as before, but now it was laced with a terrible, triumphant finality. The reflection's hand stretched out of the mirror, its fingers brushing the surface of Alex's skin as they tried to pull away. But the hand from the mirror didn't let go. It held on tight, its icy grip burning through Alex's skin. The knocking ceased all at once. Silence enveloped the house, but the silence was not comforting. It was ominous, filled with the expectation of something terrible about to happen. Alex's mind raced as the cold, skeletal fingers tightened around their wrist, pulling them closer to the mirror. The reflection now seemed to merge with the real world, the lines between reality and the supernatural blurring in terrifying ways. The figure in the glass was no longer just an image, it was real, and it was reaching for Alex, determined to drag them into the darkness. The house, once a place of refuge, had turned into a nightmare, its walls closing in around Alex like the maw of some great beast. The silence that followed the knocking was suffocating, as if the house had become a trap, and the very air itself was thick with malevolent energy. Every breath felt heavy, like 1,000 unseen hands were pressing down on their chest. Desperation surged through Alex. They tried to pull their arm free from the mirror's grip, but the more they struggled, the tighter the fingers became, as if the reflection itself was feeding off their fear. The figure in the mirror smiled, an unsettling, knowing grin, like a predator savoring the moment before the final strike. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, its rasp like nails scraping against bone. "You're mine now." Alex's heart raced. They couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All they could feel was the relentless pressure of the mirror's icy grip and the weight of the figure's presence bearing down on them. Panic surged through their veins like ice water, and the world around them seemed to distort. The knocking started again, louder and more chaotic than before, rattling the entire house. It wasn't just from the door anymore. It was coming from every direction, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, until it felt like the very foundation of the house was shaking. In that moment, Alex realized that the knocking wasn't a warning, it was a countdown. The house was not just alive, it was alive with hunger, and that hunger was for them. "No!" Alex screamed, their voice hoarse and desperate. They pulled against the mirror's grip with everything they had. Their skin burned where the figure's cold fingers touched them, but the more they struggled, the more it seemed to tighten. The reflection's eyes were now wide open, completely black, as if all the light in the world had been sucked into them. Suddenly, with one final, desperate surge of strength, Alex broke free from the mirror's grip. They stumbled backward, crashing into the floor, gasping for breath. The house shook violently, as if in protest, but Alex didn't stop. They scrambled to their feet, desperate to escape the nightmare that had trapped them in this house. With trembling hands, Alex fumbled for the door, their pulse pounding in their ears. They reached for the handle, but as they touched it, the knocking stopped. Silence, total, unyielding silence. They hesitated. Was it over? Was this some kind of sick trick? The house was still, but the air felt thick with an unseen presence, as if something was watching, waiting. Before Alex could open the door, the figure from the mirror appeared once again, but this time, it was no longer confined to the glass. It was standing in front of Alex, its hollow eyes staring into theirs, its skeletal hand reaching toward them. You should have never opened the door. It whispered. The voice was now not just in Alex's ears, but inside their mind, seeping into every thought, every memory, until it consumed them completely. In that instant, Alex understood. The knocking was not just a warning, it was the point of no return. It was the final knock. As the figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, the last thing Alex saw before everything went black were the reflection's hollow, black eyes, now inches from their face,